Welcome, everybody. I'm Ronan Hallowell. I'm the co-director of our Health, Justice, and Systems of Care course in the MD program that launched this year. It's my honor to introduce our speaker today. Just a little bit about the series. The Lunch and Learn series is an initiative of the HEAL, the Humanities, Ethics, Art, and Law program here at the Keck School of Medicine. This series recognizes the importance of bringing scholars in the humanities, social sciences, film, theater, and law, and other disciplines to Keck in order to support our collective understanding of the health of individuals, communities, and society. We're happy to host Professor George J. Sánchez. He's Professor of American Studies and Ethnicity and History here at USC. Professor Sánchez was born in Boyle Heights to two immigrant parents from Mexico and is a first-generation college student, receiving his BA from Harvard College and his Ph.D. from Stanford University. His 1993 book, Becoming Mexican American, Ethnicity, Culture, and Identity in Chicano Los Angeles, 1900 to 1945, earned 6 awards in fields of immigration history and Western history. His newly published book, Boyle Heights, How a Los Angeles Neighborhood Became the Future of American Democracy, was featured in our Health, Justice, and Systems of Care course in our first session back in August, and I've been reading the book myself and highly recommend it. His talk today is on Fearing Fertility, the Undocumented USC Medical Center and Forced Sterilizations, 1968 to 1974. Thank you so much, Professor Sánchez, for joining us.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk about and go over the part of the book that most dramatically involves the USC Medical Center. That's what I was asked to do, and I'm happy to do it. And I'm really interested in having a dialogue afterwards about what you make of this and how it fits with the overall themes of your series. And also to answer any questions you have about the book as a whole, because it goes through a lot of things, and what I'm doing is really focusing very closely on this. So let me start with a story. Bernard Rosenfeld, a resident at Los Angeles County Medical Center at USC, sought out an attorney at the LA County Center for Law and Justice in 1974. When he realized what his review of the medical records of hundreds of Spanish surname patients had surprisingly uncovered. While looking for irregularities regarding cesarean sections offered to Latina women at the hospital, he uncovered a clear pattern of coercion for sterilization with more than 180 cases of women sterilized during childbirth. Notes on the patient records largely indicated no medical indication for sterilization, either distressed handwriting showing consent or no signed consent forms at all, and recommendations for the procedure raised during the late stages of their labor, after having been administered large doses of Demerol or Valium. This data proved to Rosenfeld what he had witnessed during his medical residency at USC: the targeting of coercive sterilization of African American and Mexican women. The staff attorney that Rosenfeld encountered at the Center for Law and Justice was new at her job, but someone who would become immediately motivated to explore the potential case. That lawyer's name was Antonia Hernandez, who had just completed UCLA Law School in 1974. This was her first job. But this case would mark the start of a career in serving the Latino community. And in case you don't know who Antonia Hernandez is, she would eventually become the president and general counsel of the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, or MALDEF. And since 2004, she has been president and CEO of the California Community Foundation. So someone who's fairly significant in California legal history. But according to Hernandez, this case, quote, consumed her life as a young lawyer as she drove around East Los Angeles, identifying hundreds of women who had given birth at USC from the addresses in their medical records. While interviewing them, she would often have to pass along the information that, in fact, they had been sterilized to women who did not realize that this procedure had been carried out and also that it was irreversible. Many of the women did not know. Fearful that taking legal action against the hospital might lead to possible deportation, Hernandez had to, because many of the women were undocumented, Hernandez had to find the victims who were willing to become plaintiffs in this case. And so the actual plaintiffs that end up in the case tend to be either US citizen women or legal immigrants, and not the vast majority who were undocumented. Now, my recently published book on Boyle Heights utilizes this case, the case of Madrigal versus Quilligan, to discuss the growing anti-immigrant sentiment against undocumented aliens in Los Angeles during the late 1960s and the early 1970s. While anti-immigrant sentiments had long been part of Southern California since the 19th century, and anti-Mexican actions by the local government had been present in Boyle Heights since the 1930s repatriation campaigns, and I can talk much more about that if you'd like, the reaction against undocumented Mexican residents in the 1970s co-joined past forms of discrimination with a new virulence in a post-civil rights environment. In particular, the 1965 Hart-Celler Immigration Act had, for the first time, put Mexico under a national quota of only 20,000 arrivals per year, legal arrivals, or about 10% of what had been arriving in the United States in the early 1960s. Coupled with the elimination of the Bracero program from Mexico in 1964, the number of Mexican citizens then apprehended for crossing into the US without legal approval dramatically increased from 55,000 in 1965 to 277,000 in 1970, a really dramatic sort of increase that could have been easily predicted. Over time, the formation of families north of the border led to a greater permanence of the undocumented in Boyle Heights, the rest of East Los Angeles, and many places in Los Angeles. The shift of undocumented workers also from primarily agricultural employment in the early 1960s, particularly within the Bracero program, to more urban employment led to higher visibility by 1970 and put Boyle Heights at the center of a growing anti-immigrant hostility that clearly was happening in Southern California. Even though undocumented migrants found largely hospitable neighborhoods like Boyle Heights to reside in and low-wage jobs in the restructuring Los Angeles economy to obtain, wider hostilities towards Mexican undocumented workers and other residents began to emerge very decidedly in the late 60s and early 70s. Now, coerced sterilization at USC LA County Medical Center was one of the earliest anti-immigrant and racist backlashes against Mexican undocumented residents locally. And let me just put a history which you probably already know. The opening of County General Hospital in 1932 in the northern part of Boyle Heights, right here, was originally intended to serve a primarily white working class population. That was the dynamic of Boyle Heights, and my book kind of goes over that population in this area. But as the local population racially shifted on the east side of Los Angeles after World War II, USC became a significant training site for generations of physicians to match its growing ambition as a major research university. When government grants to the poor were increased, were increased substantially after 1964 with the War on Poverty, but especially through the passage of the Family Planning Services and Population Research Act in 1970, USC took advantage of this increased availability of federal funding for family planning services for the poor. This is directly in relationship to the increase of funding for family planning services. California now, if you don't know, had long led the nation in regards to sterilization. And I can go over, if you'd like, the longer history of eugenics in the state of California, including Rufus von Kleinschmidt's role, who was one of the USC presidents. His name was just taken off a building on the University Park campus because of this history. But there's a long history, and I can talk about the various institutions in Southern California that practiced forced or coercive sterilization of minors, of other kinds of people all through California. But California led the nation in this Even with that, the rates at the Women's Hospital of LA County Medical Center surged from July 1968 to July 1970, just that 2-year period, with these numbers. Elective hysterectomies increased by 742%. Elective tubal ligations by 470%. And tubal ligation after delivery by 151%. By the early 1970s, it would be USC doctors who would stand accused of coercively sterilizing Mexican immigrant women who came into the hospital to deliver children. Let me put some sort of more cultural context to this. Notions of a Mexican invasion of immigrants from south of the border have long been coupled with a focus on Mexican female fertility. C.M. Goeth, a Sacramento realtor, wrote in 1935, quote, "It is this high birth rate that makes Mexican peon immigration such a menace. Peons multiply like rabbits," end quote. But sociologist Elena Gutierrez, who I'll mention more specifically a little later, argues that a series of defined new social problems came together in the 1960s and 1970s that focused particular attention onto the high birth rate among Mexican women, particularly newly arrived immigrant women. First, there was a growing concern about overpopulation, particularly in the developing world, which came into focus in the US, identifying it as a strain on the limited national resources and as a source of poverty. The publication of Stanford biologist Paul Ehrlich's treatise, The Population Bomb, in 1968, led to a burgeoning concern regarding the necessity of birth control and family planning for future prosperity, and led directly to the formation of a grassroots political action group, Zero Population Growth, that focused on the need to keep family size small in the US, with a maximum of 2 children per family. Second, various national reports and commissions in the 1970s focused on the changing nature of immigration to the US, warning that at least 20% of US population growth came from increased immigration. The 2 issues most cited by these reports were that since the 1965 Immigration Act, 2/3 of immigrants to the US now came from Latin America and Asia, not from Europe, as previously was the case, and that 2, illegal immigration, 80% of which was from Mexico, produced an unlawful, unregulated population on top of the legal immigrant community. And those 2 things would keep being focused on in all the population reports from the early 1970s. One of the most important targets of this newfound concern with overpopulation and illegal immigration was, in fact, the medical professional community. This was specifically, there was a specific target of the medical community by ZPG and other proponents of population control. Especially those medical professionals charged with working with low-income, often indigent populations. According to Gutierrez, quote, "The physicians' attitudes towards the LACMC clientele and their perceptions of their own role in providing a panacea for overpopulation were intricately linked," end quote. Although there was no official policy on sterilization at the Women's Hospital at LA County Medical Center before 1974, it was clear that the practicing physicians generally sought ways to use their influence to try to reduce the birth rate among their Mexican immigrant patients. In the late 1960s, the Women's Hospital had received substantial federal funds to improve the obstetrics gynecology department and upgrade its facility. In fact, at that time, people would talk about, boy, that part of the medical center was new, was kind of at the forefront compared to other parts of the facility. This allowed LA County Medical Center to recruit several high-profile physician researchers who regularly wrote contraceptive studies for esteemed medical journals and promoted birth control among the LA County Medical Center clientele. So there's very much a link between the federal funds available for this and the expansion of this effort at the medical center. But it was to student residents at USC Medical School who would end up testifying about widespread sterilization abuse that was practiced systematically by USC physicians. Previously mentioned resident Bernard Rosenfeld identified at least 180 Spanish surnamed women who were coercively sterilized during childbirth, asked to sign consent forms while in labor, and after being given large amounts of Demerol or Valium. Rosenfeld reported that staff doctors would congratulate residents on the number of postpartum tubal ligations they completed within a week's time, and that up to 20% of LA County Medical Center physicians actively pushed sterilization on women who did not understand what was happening to them or did not communicate all their options. A lot of issues embedded here. One is that there was no requirements for bilingual services. So often these things were being communicated in English to women who did not speak English. Often the forms were only available in English. There were a lot of practices at this time that now you look back and you say, how could they have done that? But that, in fact, that was a regular practice. Dr. Karen Benker, another USC medical student, recounted that the OBGYN department put great emphasis on, quote, cutting the birth rate of the Mexican and Negro populations in their training of new physicians, and had, quote, an assembly line approach to sterilization that encouraged fear among women, afraid of what would happen if they did not sign the consent forms. Moreover, Benker acknowledged that non-English speaking women were more likely to experience medical mistreatment because there were few interpreters available, even though most residents and doctors were not bilingual. And Spanish-speaking women were often manipulated and sterilized on the basis of one question: ¿Más niños? Benker witnessed that physicians often made disparaging and prejudicial remarks about their Latina patients, degrading them because of their sexual activity, commenting on their poverty and inability to provide for a large family, and threatening them with deportation if they did not agree to be sterilized. Gutierrez relates, quote, according to Dr. Benker, these biased attitudes and behaviors were common practice on the obstetrical floor, end quote. So now some experiences from the women's side. The experience of Jovita Rivera, a 28-year-old woman whose primary language was Spanish and could not speak or read English, was exemplary of the pressure put on Mexican immigrant women. She was admitted to USC LA County Medical Center on September 13, 1973, in advanced labor for the birth of her 5th child. In an affidavit, Rivera explained what happened next. Quote, I was given an anesthetic which made me groggy and numb. I was taken to the delivery room. I spoke to a doctor who spoke some Spanish. The doctor said that it would be best to have my tubes tied as I had too many children and it would be too costly and burdensome for the government to have to support my family. I was then brought some papers to sign which I could not read and no one explained them to me. I had a great deal of difficulty in signing the papers as I was heavily sedated. I received no counseling or educational materials prior to being surgically sterilized, nor was the procedure explained to me, nor was the permanency of the operation explained to me, end quote. The effect on Mexican immigrant women that had gone into USC LA County Medical Center to give birth and ended up sterilized was incredibly traumatic to most. LA County Medical Center doctors lied to Maria Hurtado, who was told that California state law only allowed 3 cesarean sections before sterilization was mandated. There's no such law. And then she was given a tubal ligation without her consent while she lay unconscious following the delivery of her baby. It was only when she requested birth control at her 6-week postpartum visit that a receptionist told Mrs. Hurtado that she would never be able to have any more children. Dolores Madrigal, who the case was named after as the first plaintiff, was separated from her husband after she refused to agree to sterilization and was told that her husband had agreed to have her undergo the procedure. He had been told falsely that she would die if she had another child. Elena Orozco had also repeatedly declined sterilization after talking with her husband prior to labor, but finally signed papers only after intense pain during labor to be left alone, and because she thought the procedure could later be reversed. Mrs. Orozco did not realize until a year and a half later that she could never again have children. Orozco's son, born years before the sterilization, would later testify to sociologist Gutierrez about the emotional and mental health decline they witnessed in their mother, a downward slope that began with her coerced sterilization and continued for years afterwards until her death. Now, where did I get all this information, right? I think this is always a good question for people who are not historians. There's a lot of evidence. Testimony on these cases is available to any of you, to researchers, through the papers of the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, MALDEF, whose archives are located at Stanford University in the Department of Special Collections, and where I use them for this essay and for my book. In addition, there's an award-winning documentary, No Mas Bebes, which was released in 2016 by filmmaker Renee Tajima Peña and producer Virginia Espino, also a Ph.D. in history, based on this archival evidence and interviews with the women and families involved. So it's on record. You can hear them talking about these things in the documentary. And one of my former Ph.D. students from the University of Michigan, Elena Gutierrez, who's a sociologist, wrote her dissertation on this subject and interviewed many of the participants in the court case, some of the victims in Madrigal versus Quilligan, including lawyer Antonia Hernandez and Arizona State University anthropologist Carlos Velas Ibanez, who was a witness for the plaintiffs. He made available to her his personal archival collection from that case. None of them have forgotten this case. All of them remember this very vividly. This was painful, this was difficult, and they were really taken aback by what they found. The dissertation of Elena Gutierrez, who is currently an associate professor in gender and women's studies and Latin American and Latino studies at the University of Illinois, Chicago, was eventually published by the University of Texas Press in 2008. It's entitled Fertile Matters, The Politics of Mexican Origin Women's Reproduction. Now, I just served as the co-chair of USC's Academic Senate Committee on History, the history of USC. So as far as I know, USC has never made available its own archival documents related to this case or the issues surrounding the case to public or professional researchers, which, by the way, is really common practice at USC on a whole range of issues. I could talk to you about a bunch of stuff, but in this case, this is one that I really did want to find. Now, there were two court cases initially that brought these individual traumas to light and were pursued by lawyers who were products of the nascent Chicano movement in Los Angeles. The first is called Andrera et al. Versus Los Angeles County USC Medical Center. It was filed on behalf of those forcibly sterilized between 1972 and 1973, but the case itself never made it to court. It's the second, more well-known case is Madrigal versus Quilligan, which was a wider class action civil rights suit filed in 1975 in federal district court in Los Angeles, with 10 selected plaintiffs representing women that had been coercively sterilized between 1968 and 1974. The two principal lawyers working for the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, MALDEF, were Charles Navarrete and Antonia Hernandez, who charged USC LA County Medical Center, 12 doctors, the state of California, and the US Department of Health, Education, and Welfare with violating the civil rights of these women and their constitutional right to bear children. It's interesting that this case happened at the same time where there's all these efforts for family planning, including abortion rights. This was, for some people, kind of going in a different direction, and it raises issues about how women of color have to deal with issues of control of their own bodies versus other women that may be looking for other avenues to control their bodies, but not to have children, but to not have children. Even though many of those that suffered coercive sterilization were undocumented, these activist lawyers knew very well that their case was stronger by selecting 10 women who were all citizens or legal residents. And so there's one of the interesting things for me is that they had to really decide who were going to be the plaintiffs in this case, because if they brought undocumented women before, that was not only risk to the women, but also would not stand up, they thought, as likely in the case. Now, it took 3 years for this case to go to trial, and on June 8, 1978, Judge Jesse Curtis ruled against Maldef and in favor of the defendant USC doctors, claiming that they acted, quote, in good faith and with a bona fide belief that they had obtained proper authorization to sterilize, and at worst, described the case as one of, quote, communication breakdown, rather than unlawful conduct. Although disappointed in the judgment, the Maldef lawyers could take some solace in the fact that the publicity and the early legal maneuvers in the case had forced LA County Medical Center to begin to enforce compliance with the new federal sterilization regulations. So at the very same time this case was happening, there was new regulations and that had to be adhered to. And USC implemented a number of significant changes, including issues of sort of bilingual activity and things. So things were changing, and the case certainly prompted this. Early in the case, a preliminary injunction against the state forced health officials to stop using federal funds to sterilize minors and to rewrite existing Spanish language guidelines at a 6th grade level for comprehension. Because of the legal complaint, regulations regarding sterilization were revised at the state and federal levels, which made it much more difficult to engage in the overt discriminatory behavior witnessed by LA County Medical Center doctors and health personnel. Moreover, Chicana feminists and activists organized locally and nationwide to take on the issue of sterilization abuse and serve politically to make the wider community aware of the issue and to protect unsuspecting female newcomers. Comisión Femenil Mexicana Nacional, which was an organization founded in 1970, took on sterilization abuse as its principal focus in the mid-1970s. Future City Councilwoman and County Supervisor Gloria Molina was president of the Los Angeles chapter of the Comisión Femenil from 1975 to 1977. And she testified in 1977 to the California State Department of Health that politicians, hospitals, and doctors had no right to regulate the size of a Mexican family, and instead advocated, quote, that it is each woman's right to decide the number of children she will bear, end quote. Maldef created a Chicana rights project that focused on obtaining legal redress for those sterilized and new regulations to ensure this abuse would never happen again. In most cases, US-born Chicanas took the lead in pressing local officials to change their policies, and US citizens who were Mexican Americans often became the public face of those who testified to their forced sterilization. But as sociologist Elena Gutierrez makes clear, quote, there were many cases of undocumented Mexican women who were also coercively sterilized, but most feared that if they came forward, they or someone else in their family would be deported, end quote. The role of the Comisión Femenil points to the fact that locally based Mexican American organizations were among the first community-based groups to reach out and include defense of the undocumented as part of their own civil rights agenda. As William Flores has stated 25 years ago, quote, for Latinos generally, and particularly for Chicanos, the protection of the rights of the undocumented is inexorably linked to the rights of all Latinos, end quote. Nowhere was this more the case than in Madrigal versus Quilligan, and the coerced sterilization of Mexican immigrant women, where the victims range from the undocumented to the legal immigrant to the US-born citizen women. Defense of Mexican immigrant women in this instance led to a locally based commitment to include the undocumented in efforts at engagement and neighborhood protection that would later be picked up by groups in Boyle Heights like Mothers of East LA and Homeboy Industries. And I talk about their linkage to these other organizations in my chapter. Boyle Heights residents, even when confronting one of the most powerful medical institutions in their neighborhood, would not hesitate to form an inclusive approach to protecting the rights of those harmed by prejudicial attitudes and discriminatory practices. So I'll end there and hopefully take questions or any kind of comments you might have. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. I can bring a microphone to those because I know we've got folks online. So, we can also check for questions in the chat as well. We've got Dr. Schaff doing that. So, questions for Professor Sánchez here. Let me bring you the folks online can hear you.
Hi, Professor Sánchez. Thanks for the talk. I was wondering, in your research, if you found other similar practices at other California medical centers, or was it just specifically USC, LIC, USC?
There's other research that have been done about other institutions, and this goes to the longer history of kind of a history of eugenics in the state of California. So I'll give you an example. There's a historian at UC Santa Barbara, Miroslava Chavez Garcia, who's done this wonderful book on the practices of Fred Sinell's school for boys in Whittier. And so this is a juvenile kind of delinquent place in which boys, and then she expands this to girls. There's girls' places in Camarillo and other cities in which at that time, this is more the 30s and 40s, minors would be sterilized if they were seen as under a certain IQ, that they shouldn't reproduce. This was practiced pretty widespread. Again, California led the way, so there would be institutions. I don't know of another hospital that was, or medical center that was sued in this way. And so in terms of a public exposure, I'm sure there are practices like that, but in terms of another case and with this much evidence, USC seems to be particularly situated in this case. I think there may be more research, there may be more things that are uncovered, but partly it's that the case happened, and therefore there's a trail of women who were in fact interviewed multiple times about their own experiences, and that's what led to the archives being available and the documentary being produced and everything else.
Hi, thank you so much. I just have a question. Given the history of USC and your own personal history of growing up in Boyle Heights, how do you see that USC should be engaging Boyle Heights now, or should they just not, given their destructive behavior and inability to come forward?
I think that the single largest problem as USC tries to productively and positively engage with the community is their continued lack of transparency about their own past. It's a very simple thing. There have been really horrible, monstrous things that are part of USC's past, by the way, like many institutions of higher education. And the difference is really whether you make those things transparent, whether you open things up to archives, whether you let researchers look at documents you might have. USC has been incredibly hesitant to do that. And this comes from basically my year and a half as a co-chair of being a USC Academic Senate committee on this history. We really have asked President Folt to do something very different in university archives, which is to make everything possible transparent that you can. I could raise all kinds of issues. I could talk about the 10-year reign of your own dean, all this stuff. That report has never been released to the faculty at USC. So those are more recent cases. But I'm talking about even things back 100 years ago. USC has not made those things available to researchers. And in fact, their presidential archives, like every other university, Yale, Harvard, every other place we compare ourselves to, with 25 years of privacy protection, then puts things in the archives and make them available to researchers. every other institution. We know all this because of what's happened on the East Coast with the histories of slavery and in the relationship to universities. You know, Georgetown, you know, sold slaves to build its buildings in the 1850s. You know, these things have been uncovered by historians being able to allow to look at materials that then you can get to some reconciliation when and some action in the present when you do that. The unfortunate thing about USC is that they treat all this as a public relations issue and therefore don't want to make things available. I say that, yes, there's all kinds of wonderful programs at USC, all kinds of things happening that I'm very proud of, but they're never going to get over these kinds of issues, the difficult issues, if they don't become transparent. If they don't say, okay, this was in our past, here's what we have, or make them available. And that's in terms of the university as a whole, the presidential papers, that's dean's papers at institutions, that's at a whole different level. I firmly believe that these issues, I mean, look, there are now archives, I can tell you, at Stanford, at UCLA, that deal with this issue, but none at USC, even though it happened at USC. And you would think that USC has its own interest in making sure that the archives are available even from USC side, right? Who was there at the time? Are there things, you know, so those sorts of things are, to me, really important. I'm involved in a lot of stuff with Boyle Heights. I'm involved with a lot of stuff that is linked. So I do think it's important that we do that. But I think it's always going to be with this kind of asterisk until the university is much more transparent of its past. And I can talk about all kinds of things in the past. Nazi sympathizers on the faculty. The head of the German department in the 1930s was a Nazi sympathizer. The coach that went to Berlin with the USC athletes came back and started speaking at pro-Hitler rallies in the late 1930s. You know, Japanese internment issues. I mean, you know, so there's a multitude of things. And again, we're not alone. Lots of universities have had these practices. But the difference is that people have been much more open to making sure that these things are transparent in order to move past them. And USC to date has not done this. We've been asking President Folk to make sure she does this.
There's a couple questions in the chat related to this. Dr. Almariati, I think you've answered most of her question, but she also says, has anyone made efforts at reparations for these patients? I guess it would probably be difficult to do without acknowledging that it happened.
There is legislation at the state level that I don't believe it's passed yet, but in order to try to compensate those that were sterilized against their will. And that would, you know, who compensates is an issue, but there is legislation now. These practices were pretty commonplace until the 70s. In California, at least. And so there, you know, I do think that there'll probably be some kind of legislation that is passed. The issue will involve USC, will it just be the state kind of coming up with some? And of course, that population is dying. If they're still alive, they're dying off pretty quickly at this point, 50 years later.
Thank you. And Dr. Bender wants to know whether what the role of the county of Los Angeles is since they manage the hospital.
I think it's an interesting question because this particular, this may be one of the reasons why this came to light. It came to light because of residents. And so it was embedded in the educational mission of the hospital and less in the kind of county management. And this is an interesting kind of dynamic with the way that the medical center was constructed. And I've always been fascinated by the fact that it was literally residents that saw things happening in front of them and decided, this is wrong. We have to go out and tell somebody. And so they found Antonio Hernandez right straight out of law school, and that's who they told. And then she started to investigate the case, see if it was a potential case. So I think that, to me, is an interesting dynamic. It's where the line of education sits in that and where the line of kind of management of the county does. And so that's one of those places that I think, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know exactly how those things get divided, but to me, it's the fascinating part about this case. Without the younger students,
They're residents.
Trainees.
Yeah,
Right.
They're trainees.
Right. so the trainees, the residents, without them in the picture, I don't think these sorts of things would have come to light to a group of lawyers, put it that way. You know, I think the issue that you raised about what USC should be doing in the neighborhood now is probably a critical one. It's a very important one. There are other issues that should be publicly discussed, right? So right now, my last chapter, after this one, is on gentrification. And so USC, as it grows, is part of the issue with gentrification, right? It's part of the struggle that people are having. How do we create a community in which institutions can grow, hotels can be built, student housing, can happen without leading to what we're seeing in lots of LA neighborhoods, an incredible rise in rents. All of a sudden, a community that has prided itself on being open to newcomers sees low-income housing go away as rents rise, and changes the very nature of that. The issues in Boyle Heights are very dramatic. There will come a time, if we don't change policies, where mariachis cannot live in Mariachi Plaza any longer, even though it's named Mariachi Plaza, even though most of the buildings have mariachi on the names. Why? Because mariachis can't afford Mariachi Plaza anymore. The rents have gone so high because it becomes so popular, and you've got the gold line there, that mariachis are increasingly saying, I can't live here, even though that's something that Boyle Heights is known for. And so all across, it's sort of how do we enact policies, and how are we in an active discussion in the community, particularly when our own institution is affecting that dynamic, And I think it's a really important one because I don't think, there are real issues to be discussed, but they're not easy problems, right? It's not an easy solution. I'm concerned that, for example, one reaction in Boyle Heights for the people who are fighting gentrification is to not encourage college graduates to come back to their own neighborhood. I think that's really bad. It's bad public policy. I think if you grew up in Boyle Heights, you go off to college, you should be welcomed back into that neighborhood, even if you want a slightly bigger house or that sort of stuff. But if that's also pushing up rents, that's what people are against, right? Meanwhile, I know I have undergraduates, and I assume residents and students here who might rent in Boyle Heights because, of course, it's nearby, it's convenient to the people. But if that's pushing up rents, then it means that Boyle Heights isn't the same kind of neighborhood it was before. So how do we engage in a discussion about that that's productive, that actually can talk about what should the policies be in Los Angeles that are for low-income neighborhoods? What should happen? Should we have all these suburbs in which even the children born in the suburbs can't find housing in those same suburbs? So they end up going into low-income neighborhoods to try to rent because they can't live in the same place they grew up in, right? And so the policies made out in Arcadia or all kinds of cities that are against high-density housing, even when people take advantage of the public transportation, end up shrinking the housing stock, right? Not creating things. So there's public policy involved in a lot of this that then affects places like Boyle Heights. So I think we have to have really open discussions about this. And USC could be part of the solution if it had that kind of relationship to the community, right? And that could be an open discussion. But it's a difficult one. It's not an easy problem. These are not easy issues. But I think it's really important for an institution of this size and power to generate that kind of very open dialogue with people in the community.
We haven't been very good at that, as you've noted. I'm curious what you think about what the role of us as medical educators. So, here in our audience here is mostly medical students.
Right.
The residents are busy over at the hospital. But, certainly Dr. Hallowell directs the course on health justice, and part of your work appears in our course now.
Sure.
I'm hoping that will, do part of our work, but it seems to me that, much of in the history I've seen so far in recent times, it's the the stories that get to the press, or in some way find their way to a more public place for dialogue.
Right.
So I don't know quite what to do with that, but
I think that my own sense is USC is not moving, right? It's going to be here for a long time. It's going to have this relationship with Boyle Heights and with East Los Angeles for a very long time. And that gives us a certain kind of obligation to the neighborhood, to the community, to the issues facing the community that are more than just protecting the interest of USC. You have to sort of see yourself as partnership with the community long term. And that means investing in those things that make a difference. And I do think, I mean, for example, one of the programs that I think is incredibly important that USC sponsors is the Neighborhood Academic Initiative, right? And you probably know about that, in which USC partners with local schools starting at 6th grade. They basically work and tutor those students from 6th grade to 12th grade. And then they, and then it leads to incredible high rates of going to college. That's wonderful. Every program, by the way, could be improved. I looked at that from the college point of view, and I looked at those students. Most of them, though I think it's great that they're getting into college, if they go into STEM fields, they are out of the STEM field by the halfway through their first semester. Because even though USC's been working with them for 6 years, they're not ready for college-level biology. And I did that work, right? And so you can raise it, you can sort of point it and say, this is a problem. If you're working with these kids for 6 years, we have to improve the education in science so that they're ready not just to go to college, but also to stay in STEM, right? So it's though, everything can be improved, but we have to be very open about what we're finding and really work at it. So on the one hand, NAI is a wonderful program. I think it's a result, by the way, of the 1992 riots. But it could be improved. And I think about the improvement that could happen at the college level, but it leads to a larger kind of discussion. So I think there's a lot of very positive things USC is about and is doing. But I work with a lot of people doing that work. It always has to be in the context of the university, not just investing short term, but investing long-term in the relationship. And part of that is acknowledging its own history and doing that. So to me, that's what's really important. I don't have any problem. I like to say, I was born, by the way, at White Memorial, not USC, White Memorial, but right there. My parents lived on City View. That's where I was born. So this is my neighborhood. And I'm one of the few faculty, maybe, that's actually from the neighborhood. I think there's a few at different places, but not many. So part of what I always talk about to any president of the university who will listen to me or provost is, welcome to my neighborhood. This is where I grew up. You ought to gather the faculty, the students who come from this neighborhood and say, how can we improve that situation, right? And that lead to a wider discussion. I work a lot in Boyle Heights with Josefina Lopez, who's a playwright who wrote Real Women Have Curves. If you haven't seen that, it's a great play and film. It was America Ferrera's first film. And she came back to the neighborhood. She was originally undocumented. She came back to the neighborhood to add community theater to Boyle Heights because she didn't have that growing up here. And so I work with her, and we do exhibitions on Boyle Heights history at that community theater. It's really important to kind of give back to that and to raise interesting issues. And so we haven't done one, by the way, on the medical stuff. We might. That might be interesting to get USC partnered with that. But we're going to probably next do something on the environmental issues, that, toxic waste issues, prisons, Mothers of East LA, all of that kind of work that has to be discussed in relationship to the health concerns, air pollution because of the freeways, all of that. So there are ways in which to engage the local community in very productive discussions, that they learn more about the history of the neighborhood they live in, but they also learn that the history's had an incredible legacy of immigrants coming together, fighting for rights, really improving the neighborhood over time, and all of these civic organizations that have done this no matter what generation of immigrants you're talking about. I think, I'll say one last thing. The one thing I'll say to you as students is that, I was a student in 2 other places that weren't my neighborhood. As students, we have to go in with a sort of humble attitude towards the location that we go to school in, towards the history of that location, towards who lives there all the time. And that's a very interesting and delicate kind of situation. I think you want to take advantage of that history, you want to learn it, but at the same time you want to know that you are there as a traveler that's hoping to get educated and then go on in your own careers. But while you're here, to be respectful, to kind of learn, and to think about it, because wherever you end up next, you want to do the same thing in that location, right? Wherever your first jobs are, wherever you know, and that's so important, particularly as physicians, particularly as people who will serve the health needs of that local area, is to sort of be very respectful of the histories that people bring into this. And I think that if that's communicated in the education that you receive, and if that's the attitude that you have, then you're doing it right in terms of being educated in this way. It's both respecting the place here, but then thinking about that as something you want to continue throughout your career, no matter where you end up.
I think that's a beautiful place to end. And the session where we looked at your work, it was called Cultural Humility and Community Engagement, which was our very first session in August. And you just really brought it home for us, those things for our students to ponder and think about.